We are up. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate everyone joining us by WebEx again. Just want to make sure we know who's all here. We have from BSC, our project manager, Kurt Procharena, and his team, Rob Newton and Jesse Harris. Maybe you guys can wave a little. And then we have Joe Dempos, Bonnie Reemsnyder, Tim Griswold, and myself. Did I miss anybody?
Frank.
Sorry, Frank.
And Eric.
Of course, I could be looking at the screen. That would help instead of my notes. All right, I have a list of participants. Everybody's there. Thanks, everybody. Today, the focus of our meeting is to look at the preliminary design status and that BSC has been working on. This is our first look-see at the layout for Hartford Avenue, Shore Road, to look for plans at our outreach meeting and schedule our next meetings, approve any invoices other than the one we've already approved if there is one, and approve minutes. So it's a special meeting, so we can't add anything to the agenda. I'm going to, at this point, turn it over to Kurt and his team to begin the review.
Thanks, Mary Jo. Can everybody hear me okay?
So far.
All right, so apologies in advance. I'm going to share my screen at multiple points during the meeting with a few different files. So I'm going to do my best to move through them pretty quickly. And if I'm too fast on something, or if you can't see my cursor or something like that, please just let me know and I'll slow down or whatnot. So very quickly, status as of this meeting today, I'm going to share our calendar, our schedule. Everybody see that?
Yes.
Yep.
So here we are today, 5/4. We're in the latter part of the preliminary design as scheduled. I think as you'll see today, we're in really good shape for Harford Avenue. Getting there for Shore Road, I'm going to kind of break up the discussion today between those two. They are a bit distinct, so it sort of lends itself well to that. So as far as schedule, we're doing okay. I will now, and this is where it may get a little clunky, so apologies. Okay, so another general item, we received an email from DOT, and these are the folks up in Newington that administer the grant program. They are looking for an update on the project, and there's a form that they provided me. I have filled out that form. It's just about done. I'm going to send that to Mary Jo so the committee can take a look at it before it goes back to DOT. But it's kind of a standard update form where they're just wondering where we are. I did reply to them. It's Craig Babowitz up at DOT. He's in the planning group, asking if beyond the form they wanted to have a discussion, if it needed any more detail, and I have not heard back from them. So my recommendation is we'll fill out the form, we'll get it up to them, we'll continue to proceed forward, and if they need any additional information, I'm sure they'll reach out to us. Is there anything beyond those items that anybody has questions on or would like to discuss relative to general project topics? If not, I'll move on to Harford Avenue.
Kurt, just the message I had left for Craig, perhaps this form will have area to fill that out to discuss the possibility of having a longer time on the grant if we need it, the processes, et cetera.
So what we could do is once I've sent the form to you and you feel comfortable with it, in my reply email to them, I can reinforce that and say, we would like to please have a discussion about that. Can you please let us know when you're available? Does that make sense? Okay. Okay. And that way he knows that we're expecting to hear back from him, with a specific question.
Okay. The only other thing for the committee is that Frank and I touched base, I think it was Thursday or Friday of last week, to see if either of us had had any responses from any of the residents on Hartford Avenue about BSC going out and doing some data collection. We hadn't any formal responses, but BSC had added, as you guys recall, there were 5 homes that we wanted some additional data on. BSC had added number 31. And I did talk to that couple a couple of times. And they are well aware of the data that BSC wants to collect, meaning some measurements and photos. And I sent them the letter that Kurt had sort of suggested we send out. I sent them and asked them to kindly respond for my files that we had the discussion. Also, the other people on our Avenue list that hadn't been contacted formally by either Frank or myself also received a letter. I think the letters went out Friday. That's it.
And I have a graphic where I can show where we need that access, and that'll give you a little more of an understanding of why we need that access.
Okay, thank you.
So okay, so on to Harford Avenue. What I thought I might do is, if it's okay with everybody, use the same slideshow. It's been updated a little bit that we had at the last meeting, to take a quick walk down Harford Avenue, if you will. So I'm gonna share my screen. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So what we'll do, I won't spend a lot of time on this. We'll be on the phone for 3 hours if I do that, but we'll move down the street, and it's just a way to refresh everybody's memory of what's physically out there. And then with that fresh in your mind, hopefully, as we look at the preliminary design drawings, and Jesse will talk a little bit about those, it'll have a lot more context. So again, we'll do the same thing for Shore Road. So this is starting up at Shore Road 156. The light blue line you see there is the back of the right of way, approximated, of course, but it gives you a feel for what's out there. The line that you see there was originally our back of sidewalk that's been adjusted a little bit, but you can see the remnants of the old Hartford Avenue sidewalk there. There's the edge of the right of way at the back. That sidewalk will be removed as part of the project. The red numbers you see there are the house numbers. You can see in this shot, typical driveway apron, pretty level topography up on this part of Hartford Avenue, which is great. So fairly straightforward as far as putting the sidewalk in. And again, when we look at the preliminary design drawings, you'll see what this looks like in plan view. So again, little remnants of the sidewalk there. Typical mailbox, and this is one of the items we'll discuss today about how we handle mailboxes that are in the right of way. So again, you can see the various driveway aprons, various ages, various configurations. That's something that Jesse will talk about when he talks about the preliminary design drawings. You can see remnants of the old sidewalk there, and in fact, if you look very closely, you can actually see it under the grass. So that'll all come out as part of the project, and that'll be revegetated back along that line. So continuing down, there's the markings that Connecticut Water Company had done for their laterals. And you can see their main marked out in blue. Continuing down, again, the right of way in the light blue line off to your right. Up in this part of Harford Avenue, folks have generally stayed back out of the right of way. And in fact, that group of shrubs there, as an example, was probably planted at some time in the past to delineate the edge of it. So again, pretty straightforward for installation of the sidewalks. Catch basins will remain unchanged as part of the project by design. Again, pretty good topography here, lends itself pretty well to the sidewalk. Typical signage that'll be replaced as part of the project. All the signage has to be 7 feet high in a pedestrian area. These signs can be, by the way, reused. We'll put them on new posts and whatnot, but to save some money, we'll just salvage the signs if we can. So another example of some various driveway aprons. And again, pretty good as far as encroachments into the right of way. You can even see the edge of these fences and whatnot are back. So clearly people are aware in many of these properties where the right of way is, and they've stayed out of it. Continuing down, again, some aprons. Some folks do have more formalized driveways than others. As we start to get into this part of Harford Avenue, you'll notice the topography starts to change a little bit in that the roadway is at a higher elevation than the properties. And that's just a result of the topography out here, how these homes were built many years ago. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that affects the project relative to making sure the sidewalk fits in concert with the homes. So here we really do begin to change elevation. And starting with number 21, these are the homes that we've requested access to. And I think number 21, in fact, I'll look at my, you won't be able to see this, but I'm going to call it up. I don't know. Can you see that on my screen? Or are you still on the slideshow?
Blank.
Okay. Number 21 is the only property that we have not yet received permission to access. Can everyone see the photos again?
Yeah, can we call what the name was on that, Kurt?
Say that again, Frank?
Can you call what the name was on number 20, Mary Jo?
I can tell you that right now. Let's see. It is Michael Cohen,
Right.
1 Washington Avenue, Old Lyme, Connecticut. 21 Hartford Avenue.
He also received another letter on Friday.
So as I had mentioned, Jesse will be out there on Tuesday, tomorrow. We will not go onto his property until we receive formal, so we don't want to upset anybody. We will only go on those properties that we've received access for.
Kurt, just so you know, on that one, his first letter was sent to 21. The second letter was sent to 1 Washington.
Okay. So again, you can see the topography starting to drop off here, and it continues to drop off as it moves down the road. Another item I wanted to point out was the hydrant. After today's meeting, once the committee kind of gives us a green light to press forward with concept that we settle on, we will reach out to the folks that Frank had given us information for relative to Connecticut Water Company. As an example, quite often, the fire department, and I'll reach out to Dave Roberge also, if that's okay with the committee. Quite often, these fire hydrants are put closer to the curb as opposed to being set back in this manner. I will find out, number one, where the Old Lyme Fire Department wants the hydrants. Then I will coordinate with the Connecticut Water Company team to make sure that they understand relative to the sidewalk project where the hydrants are desired, both in horizontal configuration as well as the topography that we're looking at, to make sure that they understand that we have a sidewalk going in. Clearly, we want the hydrant to be level, at the sidewalk. As you can see here, it's quite depressed relative to the top of the curb, which is generally where the edge of your top of sidewalk will end up. Continuing down, typical trash bin that people have out there. Again, pretty good as far as the right of way. You could see the shrubs, the fencing are well back, so that's excellent as far as the sidewalk going in. There's Jesse. So here's an example of the fire hydrant just inboard, of the existing right of way. The fencing, it's good. It's set back. Topography again, maybe a little hard to tell in this photo, but that driveway at number 27 is quite a bit lower than the roadway surface, which is one of the reasons why we need to get some additional information on those properties, because we're probably, and Jesse can explain a little bit more about this in a few minutes, we're probably going to be back onto those properties to make the grading work.
Tim Griswold, could I just ask you,
Yes.
would the sidewalk be level with the street? And ultimately, what's going to happen, as this ground is depressed, how you rectify all that?
Yep. The sidewalk will generally be 6 inches above the street level. So you'll have the pavement surface, then a 6-inch curb, and depending on what the committee decides, either be the existing curb or a new concrete curb. At the back of the sidewalk, in the areas where we have generally level topography, we'll just use loam and seed. And as you saw in these photos, up toward Shore Road, pretty straightforward. In the properties that we're looking at here, 21, 27, 29, this area, that's something we want to talk about today, is to how we deal with that transitional area between the back of our sidewalk, which essentially our sidewalk slopes at a maximum of 2%. We'll probably design it at 1.5% towards the gutter. In general terms, looking at it, we'll call it flat for discussion purposes. So as you can see in some of these photos, it does drop off. We'll need to do something to create that transition between the back of our sidewalk and their existing yard or driveway. And that's something we definitely want to talk about today to get your feedback on how we do that.
In the worst case scenario, would that lift between the back of the sidewalk and the person's yard be 8 inches to a foot?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. And that's where you could end up putting in small retaining walls of some sort that could be either natural material, and I'll defer to Jesse on the design elements of it, but we'd be looking at either grading it down with a slope or putting in some sort of retaining, I don't want to call it a structure, but some sort of a retaining feature, maybe, if you will. So continuing down again, pretty good as far as the right of way. Again, you can see some of these aprons. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Are variable. Catch basins again won't be changed. Here's an example. Somebody has a more formalized driveway, so we'll coincide our design with the existing driveway apron. Here's an example of this fence. Is a little bit, that red arrow shows one of the property markers. That flag is on the town right of way. So one question that we'd like some feedback for the committee, because it would be incorporated into the design, is do we want to use this as an opportunity to relocate these encroachments to the edge of the right of way? I have a feeling in some of these cases, this fencing, as an example, will be removed anyway because of the work we need to do to create the transition between our sidewalk. My suggestion would be, since it's coming out, that it get replaced at the edge of the right of way, just so you don't have a long-term encroachment onto the town property. Again, moving down, the topography begins to settle back out here. You can see it's relatively flat. So once we get past those few properties where they're quite a bit lower than the street, it sort of levels back out and becomes similar to what we have up towards Shore Road. Right here is another example of something that we'll have to deal with. Clearly, the fence and the walk are in the right of way. We'll have to saw cut the walkway and then probably somehow reconfigure it. This may be an example of where we need some close interactions with the property owner to make sure that they're able to express their um, thoughts about what happens. And again, we're happy to go meet with folks and see folks and make sure that they feel like that they were heard. So when we put the design together, everybody's on the same page and people are generally happy with what the result is. Another example of mailboxes that we'll talk about. So that's a little bit of a better view where clearly we'll have to remove the fencing. The post on the right is about at the back of the right of way. So I think that post at one time was probably put there because somebody knew there's a fair amount of pins and iron rods out there. So it is possible to relocate, to locate the right of way as a homeowner. Again, pretty good topography down here as we approach Bocce. Little bit of landscaping that'll have to be moved and reconfigured. Again, the signage, some of these older signs we would recommend get replaced with newer signs. Over time, they get bleached out with the sun and their retro reflectivity gets diminished. Clearly the stop signs and those things, this is a pretty new post. We'll make sure that all this gets salvaged and reused. I think there's another view looking the other way where you can see that that blue line is approximately the right of way. So we'll have to move those items back. And then as you can see here too, the top of the curb is a little bit higher than the bituminous material where that ramp system is. So we'll have to finalize something in there as to how we make that transition so we don't have an abrupt drop off. A little bit difficult to see, but there's a door on the other side. It'd be to the right of the building that we need to maintain access to. So that's something that we have to think about. That flower pot is sort of in the pathway to that other door, but we have to be conscious that we don't want to cut off access to that door. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing that. And then we'll look at let me just quickly show this as just for completeness here. And again, sorry about the transitions. This is an example. Everybody see that?
Mhm.
This is an example of where our surveyors are going to be getting some supplemental data. I'll blow it up so you can see it. Just an example. And Jesse will talk about this in a minute, but because we know that we may be over the right-of-way line back onto people's properties to create this transition, and we don't want to create a problem onto people's properties where we have abrupt drop-offs or those kinds of things, we need to get some supplemental elevation data to make sure that we're able to, inside of the software, properly design this. So when our surveyors remobilize, we had some weather issues last week. I'm hoping they'll be out there this week, and I'll send an email to Mary Jo at least a day in advance, hopefully more. But this is an example of some of the supplemental data that our surveyors need to get.
Kurt, what exactly are we looking at when you show that?
Yeah, that was basically just one of our survey plan sheets. The red X's were just spot elevations where they basically are just going to get a topographic elevation. So then when this is in the computer, we're able to make sure that things such as their personal walkways are meeting up with where the grade ends up. Or let's say they have a landing at the bottom of their steps. It may be that in order to create that transition from the back of our new sidewalk down, that landing may end up getting buried. So what we may end up having to do is remove the landing, put in a little bit of fill material, and then reinstall the landing at a different elevation to make sure that things blend in. This was very similar to what we ran into on the last project, where at the back of our sidewalk, we ended up with a different elevation than existing construction.
Thank you.
So what I'm going to do now is open up the preliminary design plan for Hartford Avenue. And I'll just point out a couple of quick things, and then Jesse can give some commentary. And what I'll do is I'll blow it up. I know it's a little bit hard to see on the screen. Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to blow it up a little bit. I don't want to lose. So what you're seeing, the base, this is our base survey. The image that you see under there is actually what was generated with the drone. So that's a digital, it's actually not an aerial photograph. It's a digital compilation. If you recall at one of the previous meetings, I was talking about how the drone stitches together all these digital photos, and that's what you're seeing here. Kind of neat technology. But it's beneficial because it allows us to look at the design overlaying on what's really out there, as opposed to a black and white plan with sort of no context behind it. So this is really, really helpful, especially for meetings like this where we can literally see what's there. So I'm going to just give a quick couple of highlights, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jesse for some of the details. But as you can see up at Shore Road, we've got the new curb radius. We will confirm using some of the software we have the radius. I know that was a concern to try to slow vehicles down there. You can see the sidewalks in there where we're creating the transition across Shore Road. Good example of the driveways into the convenience store, pretty much maintained what's there. And we can certainly talk about that as an example. Do we want to make those driveways uniform? Do we want to leave them what's there today? If they're working, sort of operating on the, if it's not broken, don't fix it principle. 5 Hartford Avenue is a really good example of something that we need to think about. And you'll see this repeat itself a few times. If you notice, they are sharing a apron currently with 7 Hartford Avenue. Do we want to leave that, or do we want to use this as an opportunity to create individual aprons for each property? So just something to think about as we, and those are relatively easy changes to make. It's just something that these aprons and these driveways have evolved over a long time. And this is an opportunity to do some, for lack of a better term, some cleanup on some of these things and make them more uniform. Under this scenario, you could see the sidewalk. In this image, I want to clarify something, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jesse. You'll notice we have a 5-foot sidewalk. We currently have 2 options for the committee to consider that we talked about last time, and I'm going to go to the bottom of the drawing. One option on the left is what I'm calling the monolithic sidewalk, with it's essentially one piece with a new curb. You'll notice that the overall width of that sidewalk is 7.5 feet. Typically, we talk about a 5-foot sidewalk as kind of a standard sidewalk. And you'll notice Jesse has called out the 5-foot sidewalk. That 2 feet 6 inches is our zone to accommodate traffic signs mailboxes, and trash cans. We did some more dimensional analysis and came to the conclusion that 2.5 feet is an appropriate zone for those types of things. And that's based on a few things. The size of the mailboxes, the size of the signs, the clearance distance that's required for the roadway signs, and the size of the trash cans. Trying to maintain as much of a 5-foot clear given those other things as much as we can. On the right, you'll see the other option, which is the 5-foot sidewalk with a grass strip. Dimensionally, it's the same, but instead of having that 2.5 feet against the road be continuous as part of the sidewalk, it's now grass. And in this scenario, the existing curb would be maintained. So that's something that we would look some direction from the committee on what of these two options is preferred. Once that's defined, we can then very rapidly wrap up the preliminary design relative to the layout of the sidewalk. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jesse to talk a little bit more about some of the aprons, some of the thoughts on what those aprons are. And please, this is an opportunity to give us feedback, ask questions, et cetera, et cetera. Jesse, do you want to maybe talk a little bit about, you know, when you laid it out, some of the aprons, the quotes, and those kinds of things?
Yeah, can everybody hear me all right?
Yes. Yes.
All
Hi,
right.
Jesse.
I apologize if my internet connection cuts out. It's been cutting out a little bit with Kurt speaking, so I don't know if it's on my end or someone else's, but yeah, so we basically had laid out that typical cross section again on the plan. It could be either a grass strip or paved, as Kurt had mentioned. And we ran that section all the way down from Shore Road to Bocce Lane. And just starting to get a horizontal idea of how things are laying out. Relative to all the curb cuts and driveway aprons, we had basically at this point have matched the existing width, but we did make a uniform radius into each of those, and that's a 5-foot radius. One thing that we'd like to discuss and get clarification on is if we wanted to go across down the street and make all driveway widths uniform. Your town regs talk about that at this point. Single property driveways are a minimum of 10 feet wide up to 20 feet wide maximum. And then common driveways or shared driveways where we have a few of those on Hartford Avenue. Minimum would be 16 feet and maximum, I don't recall what the maximum was, but so those are the type of things we want to just get some feedback from the group. Do we want to go down wherever there's a single driveway apron, say here at 23, do we want to just give everybody the same width? That way, somebody's saying, well, I didn't get 20 feet, I got 10 and this person got 20. It makes sense to give everybody that has a single driveway, 12 feet or whatever the committee thinks is appropriate. And then where there's some shared driveways, especially here at 27 and 29, again, kind of a discussion. 27 now has 2 curb cuts, but 29 does not. And there's other instances of that as well, where some lots have 2 and some only have 1. Do we want to take this opportunity to kind of give just 1, or are they grandfathered in with 2? Not sure how you want to handle those. So those are kind of the driveway aprons that we'd like to discuss. There's some other intricacies to that as well in terms of the town's regulations. In terms of slope, right now the regulations talk about asphalt, or the driveway should be paved to the right of way or 15 feet
Lose them or just me?
Just, we
And
Jesse?
Yep.
Jesse?
where did you lose me?
Jesse?
Yes. I'm here.
We lost you when you started talking about the slope of the aprons with respect to the regulations.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Yeah, there are slope requirements in the current regulations with the town, not to exceed 5% within the right of way. That might be very difficult to do, because we're going to try and chase from the back of our sidewalk down to their existing driveway elevation, ideally as quick as possible. And then there's a lot of discussion about in the regulations about basically a hump from the edge of the road down to the driveway. We got to make sure a car traversing that can clear that without bottoming out either in the road or on the sidewalk portion. I think we can accommodate those, but it really kind of plays into how much onto the properties do we kind of reconstruct to get the driveways to work.
Jim brought that up at the last meeting. So as an example, we'll look at one of the properties that's a little bit low that we had talked about. 27 is a good example. Here you've got your roadway surface. Our sidewalk is 6 inches above the roadway. So this ramp section, which will be concrete, ramps us up to the sidewalk, which is, as I mentioned, for all intents and purposes, flat, 1.5% going in this direction toward the road. Then we can begin our transitional area back here. So as Jesse was just mentioning, we don't want to slope this down so steeply to get down to this elevation that a car will bottom out right here. So in order to create a ramp, we may very well start at this point, and that ramp may actually extend down that far. That's why that elevation data is very important to us to understand the vertical geometry of that ramp. So now if you imagine us having to have that ramp come all the way down to here, you can see where then that begins to affect how this walkway intersects. Then that has a corresponding effect of this elevation, and it all kind of relates together. So that's one of the things that we'll be taking a very close look at. That's why we need that extra data as far as the elevation of the house, the pads, the walkways, and those kinds of things.
And Kurt, this is Mary Jo, obviously. It makes no difference whether we have the bituminous side curbing or a monolithic curbing or leaving the curb as it exists for this concern, correct?
That's exactly correct. In fact, the ramp sections would be no different between either scenario.
Okay. Thank you.
And what I think,
Oh.
Go ahead, Jesse.
I was just going to note that, what you're showing on the image right now is an example of where do we want to remove an apron, because currently 19 has a shared driveway apron. Looks like this other one was kind of added in, and either scenario, they're generally parking on the grass. They don't have a real defined driveway, but that's just an example. Do we want, as part of this project, to remove aprons to kind of clean up just the frequency of curb cuts?
And if you can think of the sidewalk, every time we cross an apron, we've got these ramps. It could end up being a lot of ramp sections. As Jesse mentioned, particularly some of these properties have 2 curb cuts. Do we limit them to just 1? This is an example of where there's an apron. It looks like there's probably some informal parking, if you will, there. They've got theoretically 2 aprons, the one that splits with them and their neighbor, 19 and their neighbor. So that's something that we look for some direction from the committee on. Do we want to do some cleanup? As Jesse had mentioned, number 27, as an example, has 2 driveways. Do we run the risk, if we give them 2 driveways back, of another property owner that maybe currently has 1, says, well, wait a second, they got 2, I want 2. So we would look for some direction from the committee on that.
Do you recall, Jesse or Kirk, you recall what the driveway cuts were when we did on the southern part of Harford Avenue, what the dimensions were?
Off the top of my head, I can't recall. We could easily check that though. And momentarily, I'm just going to quickly show an image. Bear with me for a second. Let's see. And this just gives things some context of real world. Sorry, that's a little bit grainy, but there's an example of under the monolithic scenario. You can see we have the sidewalk, the ramp itself for the street level, and then you've got your flat section of the sidewalk. So that's kind of what it would look like. And it's pretty much what we did on the other portion of Harford Avenue. So just to give it some context. Let's see.
Kurt, if you have a 2.5-foot section at the beginning near the curb, and then a 5-foot panel for the sidewalk, would the ramp have to create a different angle through the sidewalk panel as it comes up from the street? That image you had, it looked like that front section was wider than 2.5 feet and sidewalk was narrower than 5 feet perhaps. So from a concrete standpoint, would the sidewalk panel need to be dipped a little bit to accommodate the ramp coming off the street?
Yeah, the sidewalk panel itself generally needs to be that maximum of 2%. The dimensions of the sidewalk in the image might have varied from what we have, but that's something that Jesse will be looking at in more detail to create. And again, hopefully you can see my screen here. This,
As the apron comes from the street, at the sidewalk, will it have to have a dip in the sidewalk to accommodate the grade coming up?
no, the goal is to not have a dip in the sidewalk itself. The goal is to make that 6-inch transition in this ramp section.
Okay.
And then let's see, there's an image, again, bear with me. Jesse did a nice graphic. I just want to show. Sorry about the delay. Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
So in this case, the driveway aprons are bituminous. We're proposing that they be concrete. They'll be much easier to construct. But this is just an example of what the monolithic sidewalk would look like. Again, just it's food for thought. We're not saying this is exactly what we would have out there. The brick material you see there are pervious pavers. we in the end probably wouldn't do that, but kind of an example of what it would look like. And personally, I think it's going to look fantastic. I love seeing these kinds of images because you can really, really, begin to understand in sort of real world terms what this thing is going to look like. You can see the mailbox down there, why that 2.5-foot strip is appropriate for that. And you can envision a trash can. Again, with the trash cans there, we still want to be able to have a full 5-foot sidewalk for people to traverse. This is a good example of, if you look to the right of the image, where we're able to just blend in loam and seed right back. So for most of Harford Avenue, this is what it would look like because the topography lends itself well. It's as we approach those properties down by the American flag that we may need to do something a little bit more because we are so much higher than. But this is in this image too. It's a good opportunity. You can see the ramp right in the foreground. How just in that ramp section, we transition from roadway elevation up the 6 inches to top of sidewalk. And again, that'll be concrete.
What percentage would that be?
I'm not that good with math in my head, but we can certainly get that info for you.
Kurt, if the bottom of the curb is 6 inches beneath the sidewalk, you've got a 6-inch slope that you have to accommodate in 2.5 feet. Am I correct in that?
Yeah. So whatever that math works out to be.
So that's going to be more like a 40% slope.
Yeah, and that's where we may have to look at adjusting the sidewalk. We'll run some cross sections. And again, it's pretty common because it is such a short little section that's very, very common in most cities and towns where you've got just a small transition. So you guys certainly wouldn't be, unusual relative to that. But we'll look at that in cross section. We'll look at the town regulations over the next day or so and see where we fall relative to the town regs and requirements. One of the challenges here is the more we push this sidewalk back from the road, the more your cost goes up, because now we, again, as these properties in the particular areas that we're concerned about the elevations, as that elevation drops away, it means there's more and more work to accommodate the back of sidewalk with the transition down. At some point, we'd no longer be able to make a sloped transition. We'd have to get into retaining walls and those kinds of things because we'd be taking up people's front yards. And it's also important to note that these people have to, in some way, agree to this work, right? If we want to maintain a safe condition, we don't want to have significant drop-offs at the back of the sidewalk. So we're trying to sort of strike a balance with the cost and the available real estate. So anyway, that's a good graphic to kind of let you know what things may look like. I will open up drawing again. Everybody see that?
Yep.
And just if the committee sees on the left, at least it's on the left of my screen where it says there's a little option where you can, the plus and minus, you can zoom in yourself also. You hit that.
Good to know. Are you still on the line? Did we lose Jesse?
He's here. But
No, I'm here. I was just muted.
Yep. No, just wanted to make sure. Is there anything else that you wanted to highlight?
No, luckily there's not a lot of like amenities that we'd have to address. Kurt touched on some of the fencing and some of the walkway things. on the private properties. The hedgerow at 37 might be something we might have to prune back, as in not necessarily encroachment on the right of way, but more so on the walkway. And that's something I'll be down on the site tomorrow, and I'm going to look at that in particular, amongst other things. But that might be something we might have to prune that hedgerow back a little bit.
Another area to point out is, as we took the walk down Hartford Avenue, this area in here, where we have the sidewalk, and you can, in this image, really see where that front walkway pops out. So our recommendation would be to essentially cut it at the right of way, and because it's a nice right angle, and then figure out somehow to transition it either to the sidewalk or something like that. But there's an example of where we would look to the committee to kind of determine, how do we want to interface with these property owners? Would you like us to come up with initial ideas and recommendations and then pass them on to you, and then those could be presented to the property owner? Would you like to provide the property owner an opportunity to meet us out there? And I know that's a little strange during these times of social distancing, but we're looking for some guidance on how we take that next step to actually implement some of these, what I'll call finite elements of the design on these properties.
Well, I think personal contact would be a great opportunity for everybody to make sure that everyone's on board. I also think though that it's important that that they get an idea of what our thoughts are prior to that personal contact. If we just walk in and say, "What do you want?" they could ask for the moon. So it'd be perhaps more effective if we say, "Hey, we've got this kind of plan. We think it's going to work great. We know we'd like to get your input on it." That might be an easier way to handle it and get things moving in the right direction.
This is Jim here. I agree with Frank on that. I think if you guys come up with the ideal design, something that ties in the entire project, for each of the driveway cuts for these areas of encroachment. So if you come up with the ideal, we can present it to the homeowner, and then maybe something we haven't thought of, something that the homeowner knows that we don't know, for example, that we may have to tweak the design based on their comments. But it'd be good to have an ideal design that we could present to them, that they could react to.
Okay.
I think part of this, though, we have to have a discussion about what we want to do about properties with two entrances and properties. Because those are the problem areas. Problem down here is that the alternative to parking on their property is paid parking on street. Even if they get a pass and they don't have to pay park on the street, getting parking on the street is very difficult when it's really busy. And that's probably when they're using the parking all over their property. I can foresee people being upset if we take away the access that they've had. The one further, up Hartford Avenue, I'm sure that they use that grass area to park their guests, and they're going to be upset if we take away that apron. So we need to have a discussion as to how we're going to handle it. And I think it's going to be very difficult to make the case that taking away decades is going to make anyone happy, so I think we have to tell Kurt what that ideal is before he can put it together.
I agree with you, Bonnie. I think you bring up a great point. if somebody has two driveway cuts into their property, I mean, because these properties are so narrow, it's likely they use both sides of the property to park cars, maybe not for their guests, maybe just for themselves. So removing one, essentially removes 50% of their opportunity to park. I'm more inclined to say, if you have a cut, you can keep your cut, but we're just going to make it a uniform width, 10 feet, 11 feet, whatever it happens to be. And leave it at that. Give people the opportunity to remove a cut if they want, but not to add one.
I would agree with you about adding. I don't think anyone should add anything. Because that process we have. But for instance, at 29, where we all know there are problems with the grading anyway, that access is not just to one property, that's two properties. They have an extra wide, and I shouldn't say two properties, two houses. They have an extra wide driveway, but one is used for the front and one is used for the back, from my recollection. How are you going to take that away from them? I think you're going to be in for a fight.
Oh, I agree with you. We shouldn't. We can't take it away from them. I agree that if it exists, it exists. So I'm not saying take anything away. I say if somebody wants to on their I voluntarily remove one, that's fine, but they can't add one. So
Yeah,
I'm
I
saying,
agree.
yeah, if it exists, it stays. Yeah.
This is Eric. I agree with that. If they have a curb cut, one or two, let's plan to give them back the one or two, and just make them uniform down the street. So it all looks good, but
It would
everyone
be
still
nice
has the
to-
access they have right now.
Yeah, I think we're going to be in for a fight if we try to take away access. And I don't think that's really the intention. We're trying to make it safer for pedestrians, not take away from the people that pay the high taxes there.
Agreed, 100%.
Sounds like we're on the same page. Mary Jo, Tim?
Yep. I think another question would be Easy Mart. Do we know whether they would prefer to keep that wide apron before you get up to right just shy of 156? Because I think it's open now. And if we insert that little section there, is that, have we talked to them about their reaction to that?
I missed part
Ms.
of
Mary
that.
Jo, I believe that we made a decision to not yet have a formal discussion. Correct me if I'm wrong, Frank, with Easy Mart. You've had some informal discussions till we kind of had some idea what we were thinking.
If I recall, you're right, Mary Jo, but one of the conversations we had, and I think I'm going to talk to Kurt about this, when the gas station did their renovations a couple of years ago, DOT required a specific driveway entrance not to exceed a number. And so if that's what Best Way had to deal with, and that's really what should Easy Mart should have to deal with, even though they're not doing the renovations, we're doing the renovations. But I believe there's a maximum cut for driveway entry. You could correct me, Kurt or Jesse, but I know that we had this conversation with Best Way a couple of years ago when they did the gas station, because their cuts on Harford Avenue and Swan Avenue were gigantic, and they were required to tighten them up.
Yeah, for their cut on Shore Road, I think right now my recommendation would be to leave it as is, as Jesse has shown. If you notice, we're pulling the sidewalk over this way so we can access the crosswalk. I think what Tim is talking about is here on Harford Avenue,
Right.
where he actually has two cuts. Is this an opportunity to, similar to what they did, or what they have, I should say, across the street? Do we reconfigure this and maybe he only has one cut or something like that? Now we have a hydrant here, which, keep in mind, may move, right? So as part of the water project, this hydrant could move. So we do have that flexibility. In other words, yeah, go ahead.
Water line on Harford Avenue is already there. They're not doing anything with the actual water line on Harford Avenue.
Okay,
So that
just putting
portion
in
of
service laterals?
some service laterals. And I don't believe that the service laterals are going to be occurring on the west side. They're probably going to be occurring more on the east side of Harford Avenue. Houses on east side of Hartford Avenue are serviced through a alley main, and they're going to be reconnecting those houses up to Hartford Avenue north on the front yards. The west side of Hartford Avenue, I believe they're not going to do much with. The only thing they might do is just raise the fire hydrants to meet our topography.
All right, so I'm happy when I interface with with both Connecticut Water and their engineer, I can find out if their current plans are to do something with that hydrant at this location. For example, we don't want them to move it to a place that now has a negative impact on us, right? So I'll confirm just what their plans are. And they may say, we're going to leave it alone, fine. But yeah, he has these two entrances now. And clearly it's because the ideal way this is configured is there's an in and an out sort of thing. This entrance over here, you can sort of look at it as independent of this entrance and exit being a corner property. That's pretty common. So Shore Road traffic would tend to use this. Hartford Avenue traffic would tend to use this, whether it actually happens that way or not, to be determined, but pretty common on corner properties to have two separate points of ingress and egress.
Yeah, I think the south entrance on Hartford Avenue is for the dumpster also.
Yep, right back here.
Yeah.
Yep, makes sense.
Yeah, again, I think they're going to be reluctant to give anything up. But it's worth a conversation with them.
So,
I'm not sure we're asking them to give anything up here. It doesn't look, we're not asking them to change, to remove any entryways, just to clean up the entryways a little bit. I think that's what we're doing here. I think with the right graphics, with the sidewalk, it should be, I wouldn't say easy, but a lot more palatable.
I did want to point out, and Jesse, please chime in as needed. Right here, you can see that we are on his property.
Yeah.
It's just a function of the roadway, where the DOT right of way is, where the Harford Avenue right of way is. We would need some sort of permanent easement for that section of sidewalk to make that work. So that's something that I just wanted to highlight.
so it sounds like 277 may have some special discussions we have to have with the property owner. Is that correct then? Including an easement?
Yes.
So do you think to help BSC, we could have a motion that that the committee agrees to maintain existing aprons on Hartford Avenue, but with some standardization? Does that make sense? Cleaning them up.
Yep.
Well, I think that just to modify that a little bit, allows existing aprons to be maintained. So that gives the option if somebody wants to remove one, they can.
Okay, how about this? That the committee makes motion to allow existing aprons on Hartford Avenue to be maintained, but standardized?
Yeah, that's reasonable.
Okay, I'll make that motion. Is that a second, Frank?
Yes.
Okay, discussion? All in favor, raise hands.
Aye.
Eric says aye.
Thank you, Eric.
Your hand being raised, Eric. Okay, that's good. That's very good.
I'm waving, but no one can see me.
Our current,
Okay, it's unanimous.
About the treatment of the 2.5 foot, I'm just concerned if it's allowed to be grass, will that be a maintenance and it might look pretty shabby in certain places, in other places it might look good. Do we want to have it simply whatever material we're using and not have it to be dirt or grass?
That's.
I agree with you.
discussion. We have to have a,
It should be,
discussion on that.
Yeah, I think it would look nice if it were a stamped material so that it was different looking than the sidewalk itself. Gave it a little bit of style. It doesn't have to be real fancy or anything, but I just really like the image that you've got there with what looks like brick versus the sidewalk itself. It definitely clarifies that that is and stuff like that. It's going to be too hard to maintain grass.
Yeah.
I saw the graphic you had was stamped pavers. Would that be stamped pavers, colored stamped pavers to kind of match what we had in the bump outs down the southern part, but only stamped concrete?
Yeah, our recommendation, and in fact, I'm going to just pop up another image if I can do this correctly. Bear with me.
While Kurt's doing that, Frank, you brought this up before the Soundview Commission last week, and it sounded like there was some consensus, similar consensus that they prefer the concrete.
Yeah, I thought since it was a question mark, it might be a good idea to get some other thoughts on that. And they felt that the stamped concrete or the concrete buffer was appropriate and would work well. So
Thank you for doing that.
Can everybody see that photo?
Yep.
So not exactly what we have, but there's an example of that strip may be a little bit more than 2.5 feet, but our recommendation would be that it be integral with the sidewalk and that it is just a colored stamped section. We think for resiliency purposes, and because it's very, very linear, it lends itself well to that. I think it'll save you some money versus trying to put pavers in there because it's all monolithic. If you recall, for the bump outs on the other part of the project, we had granite curb, so they were able to adjust things to fit the pavers in. Here, it's all one piece. So we would recommend that whatever ultimately is chosen, it just be all monolithic concrete, and then it's just stamped.
yeah, I think a single pour would be the quickest and least expensive way of handling it, and that's sounds like what you're recommending.
Here's another example. So you can see the hydrant in this photo. That's a very typical location for a hydrant, as opposed to back in the grass at the back of the sidewalk. So that's something that I'll ask Connecticut Water and their engineers about.
So how about a motion for the committee's recommendation for BSC on this important aspect?
I'll make a motion that we go with the monolithic versus the grass. And the actual detail of it, we can decide on as we go along.
I'll second.
Thank you, Jim. Further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Eric?
Aye.
Any abstentions? Everybody's in agreement. Thank you.
So as a subset of the ramp discussion, as Jesse had mentioned, there is a few, I'll call them wayward aprons these locations. One here. One here. Does the committee want to include formal curb cuts at those locations? Where was the other one? I'm sorry. So I believe there was 1, 2, 3 of those locations.
Well, the question, are these active or do we have any evidence that they're active aprons?
Wouldn't it be simple just to ask the owner?
Agreed. That's what I'm getting at here.
So we can okay, yep. So it occurs at, I'll actually start at the top of the street.
Okay.
So we have one at 11 Hartford Avenue. Right here. 19
That's the Carney
Hartford
residence?
Avenue.
Okay, that's the car.
Yes, Carney. Yep.
Harmony.
19 is Randy Bernard, who can't seem to find.
Right here. And then the other one is at 19. Oh, I'm sorry. That's the same one. Okay. Yep. Sorry about that. So there's only 2 of them. So that's good. At least there's only 2.
And by wayward, what do you mean specifically?
There's no, most of the other ones you can see that there's parking.
Associated with it.
They're sort of just, they dead end in the grass.
Okay.
And clearly, as somebody mentioned before, during the summer, I'm certain that they're using those to access and they're just parking on the grass.
I think we, like Tim suggested, we need to have a conversation directly with those people, and find out what their thoughts are. It's only 2 of them, so.
So do you propose maybe, is there a way, Kurt, you could send us individual graphics, just a, cut out of their properties that we could use for these discussions or correspondence with these 2 owners?
Yes, absolutely.
If we can find them?
I've got some ideas on the number 21 Hartford Avenue. I think one Washington is actually part of Miami Beach Association. I'll try to reach out to Gary Fox this afternoon. Tim, you're going to get me his phone number, remember? So.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's 11 and 19. Confirm.
Hey, Kurt, can I ask a quick question?
Yes, absolutely.
Going back to the Easy Mart, there appears to be just a small section of sidewalk that's actually on their property.
Yep.
Most of that appears to be on what is now pavement for the apron of Hartford Avenue. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So we're not actually taking away any existing grassy area or property that he's using either as a buffer or for aesthetic purposes. What we would be doing is taking what is now roadway.
Yeah, that's
that
correct.
Okay.
If you, let me see if I can blow this up a little more. There's a ever so slight spot right in here, but
Mhm.
yes, for all intents and purposes, if you notice, here's the existing curb line.
Mhm.
And you can see our back of sidewalk, at least right in here, is about equivalent there.
Mhm.
And then over here, where it's grass, that's DOT property anyway.
Right.
So you're correct. We are taking away right where the hand is, 2 square feet of
Right.
of lawn. Most of the other areas is either on town property or state property.
So we're not doing him any substantial harm. We're just taking away roadway, essentially. What's
That's right.
part of his property that he's not, able to use at this point.
That's right.
All righty. Thank you.
a good
Well, the gateway sign does show up, it would be on his property, am I correct?
Yes, as it's depicted now, it would be. And of course, that's an optional element
But
that
it
doesn't
already was,
necessarily.
correct?
There is a sign there now. There is some signage there now, which I think we have a permanent easement regarding.
That's good. Would it be possible to get us those easement documents?
Yeah, I just got to figure out where they reside. So I'll have to think about that a little bit.
Because if we can put them on there graphically, that might be a big help.
Frank, were they recorded?
I believe so. Kate, I forget what her name was, originally put that together, and I think the easement actually was with the Soundview Beach Association. I'll check with Gail on that today, but they may have very well been recorded, so maybe we could check with Town Hall.
Frank, let me give you the number, 203-948-1617.
That's the number for who, Gary?
Yep.
Thank you.
So another item on my list of questions, we have the sidewalk cross section, so thank you for clarifying that. We have the question about the driveway aprons. That's great. Thank you for clarifying that. A few remaining questions. Relocation of encroachments. As I pointed out, and as Jesse had mentioned, we have a few areas where there's some primarily down as we approach Bocce. Now, clearly at, for example, 37, we have no choice. We have to relocate them. But the shrubs, the little fence section on 31, other than that, there's really not many other encroachments as we approach Shore Road. What's the committee's pleasure on moving those types of things back out of the right of way, or I should say to the edge of the right of way?
We had a brief discussion about this at our last meeting, and if I recall, if the encroachment didn't have to be moved for whatever construction purpose and it wasn't creating a problem, we were going to allow the homeowner to leave the encroachment there with the written understanding that should at any point in time it had to come down, it would be replaced outside of the town property. Am I correct on that? Do I recall that properly there?
I recall that discussion as well, but based on what Kurt said earlier, it looks like that fence is probably going to have to be moved to do the construction. I would say the only thing in question really are the shrubs, and within reason, if they can be I don't know, you trim too far and you've got an awful looking thing. So I think those bushes should be handled with care. And everything else, it looks like it really has to be moved. If we end up with anything that doesn't have to be moved, I say we have an agreement with the homeowner that once it's taken out, it can't be replaced. But leave it as is.
In that location, yeah.
In that. I don't know that
Those
exists.
white fences clearly have to go.
Right, absolutely.
Should the, the people obviously knew that they were putting them on town property. Should they be responsible to move them back on their land or what?
And that's a good question, and I'm going to ask that same question when we get to the Shore Road discussion. Should the project be responsible to relocate those materials? Well, it could go a few different ways. Should the project be responsible to remove them? Should the project be responsible to remove and reinstall them? nothing says that if the project removes them, that the project has to reinstall them. So there's two different, I think it makes sense for the project to remove them if people don't want to, but another option is to tell people you have to remove it because we're coming through here with a project. So a few different scenarios for which way that you could decide to approach it.
I think if we leave it up to the homeowner to remove, we may not have it removed in the time frame that we want it removed. As far as, so I don't see a problem with us removing it. There's not that much there that's going to create that, be that costly. I think it's the reinstallation part that we really have to think about here and determine. And I guess that would depend a lot on what the Shore Road situation is. I mean, right now we're only looking at a couple of fences to reinstall, which is not a big deal. If we're looking at Shore Road, we need to be consistent across the project scope. So I can reserve my thought process on the reinstallation after we discuss Shore Road.
Well, Shore Road is much more difficult to get a grip on. You know, clearly Harford Avenue, everybody's been pretty darn good about not putting things in the right of way. I think when you get up along Shore Road, I don't think anybody knows where the boundary is. So I think it's somewhat different between the two.
I agree. I think that we should be willing to remove them, but request that the homeowners remove them and say, if it's something that you can't get done, we will remove it. Please let us know where you want to. I don't think that we should be reinstalling it because, you know, those are fences that have been there for a while. What if they're not in good shape and they, you know, they break as we're putting them back in? Are we now going to replace the sections of fence? You know, I think ideally they remove them, but I agree with you. It may not be in a timely manner. So we say if it's not removed by this date, we will have to remove it. And you need to let us know where.
I can,
if we can
I agree
put
with
it on
all
your
of you.
property.
I can speak to number 30. I can speak to number 31 because they're elderly and I've had 2 discussions with them. Because we moved and replaced some fencing on the lower half of Hartford Avenue, we have some precedent for doing that, with Dino in particular. With these people at 31, what I did tell them was that if it needs to be removed, we would do it. I also said we had precedent by replacing it at Lower Hartford Avenue. So these people are elderly. They're not there full time. I think if we, I'll be happy to revisit it with them, but I think that with some of these people, if we're going to get their buy-in, I think we have to be willing to replace a couple things, and that fence is important to them.
Well, it's really affects 31 and 37. I mean, that's really the only 2 areas it affects.
Yeah.
37 might be a little bit more complicated in terms of replacement.
37 is also fairly recent as well. My concern and I agree with Mary Jo on the fences on Hartford. I don't think they're going to be a huge expense or a big deal for us to do. And we did it on Lower Hartford. So, to tell a homeowner, especially the one, I think 31, well, you have to remove this and put it back, it's only a foot. I don't think it's something that would be a big deal if we moved it. Where we have to discuss it as part of the Hartford Avenue scenario is the Shore Road scenario. You have some signage, particularly like Dimitri's, that's been there, I would say, at least 40 years in the state right of way. The state has clearly been okay with it. The state's very well aware of where their right of way is. And they've been okay with some of these commercial signs being in their right of way for quite a long time. So for us to go to them and say, hey, you're going to have this expense. You're going to have to take down your sign and do whatever with it. It's going to be it's going to be a sticky situation for us. So I think we definitely have to consider.
I add something.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, some of this is breaking up, so if I'm interrupting anyone, I apologize. When we did Hartford Avenue, we were removing a fence that was on his property. It was not on town property, down on the corner there. And we said that we needed to remove that fence in order to do the work. So we were obligated to put it back because it was on his property. And in the end, he said, we agreed to that. We compromised to, make things work out. Here you've got a couple of fences that are clearly on town property. And, nobody came to ask for permission. So it is a different situation. I agree there was precedent, in one situation on Hartford Avenue, we looked the other way with, 4 inches on, it's a situation, but where we put in another fence, it was on his property. We didn't remove it from town property. So there is a difference there. And as far as 40 years on town property, down on Shore Road or on state property, it still doesn't give anyone the right to think that they have the right to keep things on state or town property. It doesn't work that way. They still, for that long. That's, my understanding of what the legality of it is.
Kurt, if I recall at our last meeting, DOT had plans to do some major renovations on Shore Road over the course of the next several years. In their renovation scope of work, would they be requiring some of these encroachments to be removed?
I don't know. I suspect based on what they described, probably not, but I can certainly inquire as we talk to them. They indicated that they had plans to repave Shore Road from where they ended their last project. And I'm not exactly sure where that ended. It may be down by the Amtrak crossing. I'm not exactly sure, but from that point all the way up to the Baldwin Bridge. Typically for just straight repaving projects, they would just mill the existing pavement and then repave it essentially in kind. But I can certainly inquire if there were other aspects of that project that included anything beyond, we'll say, the curb line.
The result is still the same. The messenger is different.
Yeah, and when we talk about Shore Road, as a few folks have mentioned, we'll point out, and some of those encroachments are very apparent when we talk about where the sidewalk needs to go.
This is Eric. As far as these encroachments, not so much on Hartford Avenue, but the ones on Shore Road, at this point, can't we design as if we would replace this or move the signs, and when this goes out to bid, to see if we could even afford to do it with the entire grant. I mean, if it comes down to we have the money because we can only spend it on construction, and we can get everything we want and include moving the signs, I would be for, let's do it. But I think at this point, we can at least plan that we're going to move it and then see what it comes back in a bid before we start negotiating with individual owners or deciding that.
Yeah, that's certainly an option. And there's a few in particular that we'll point out when we get to the Shore Road discussion that there's on a few of these, there's a lot to think about.
My question is, if we remove a sign and reinstalls the sign, many of those signs are not conforming to zoning regulations. So what happens at that point in time if you move Dimitri's sign that may be oversized for his amount of square feet of commercial space? Do we reinstall, or does he reinstall the same size sign because it's quote unquote grandfathered, or does he have to comply with the new with the zoning regulations on sign size?
Yeah,
It's
and
a
that's
question, I
definitely,
don't know.
yep, that's definitely so I had one more Harford Avenue item on my list, and this sounds like a really good point to transition to Shore Road, because this is a very salient discussion to that. My last design question for now, asterisk, for Harford Avenue is mailboxes. As you saw with some of the photos, we have various mailboxes. Some of the posts are in various states of repair. You saw the one section there where there was even a post with no mailbox. Given that we are going with the monolithic sidewalk, all of the mailbox posts will be in PVC sleeves, very similar to the way the DOT standard details are for signposts. Does the project want to remove and reinstall new mailboxes? Does the project want to remove mailboxes, provide the sleeve, and then tell the individual property owner they need to reinstall it? Does the project want to reinstall the existing posts? So a few things that we need to think about there. And we would look for some guidance from the committee on that.
What type of post would you recommend if if we decided to take that responsibility? Not the mailbox itself, what type of post would you recommend?
Yep. I would definitely recommend something that's like a powder coated steel. Wood is fine for a homeowner installation, but as we can see, it just doesn't last. Whereas I think if we got a uniform, that's the other thing I would recommend, is that if the project provided them, they all be identical. You know, a Jesse could come up with something, but just a straightforward square steel tube, powder coated black, that gets put in a sleeve. The other thing that I like about the steel, besides its obvious durability, especially down in this area where it may be subject to flooding or other things, is the fact that we can use a smaller post. So that means we have a smaller sleeve. It's just a little less visually apparent. Whereas if you have a 4x4 post, the sleeve starts to get kind of large. It's not as nice looking. So that would be our recommendation.
Kurt, this is Eric. If we, because doing the project, if we remove something, because we're putting a sidewalk in, we would be required to, at a minimum, reset what was there, correct?
It depends. So similar to the discussion of the fencing, if there's a bit of fence that's on town property, you're absolutely not obligated to reinstall it. When it comes to things like mailboxes, now you start to get into federal regulations because it's U.S. Postal Service. I would have to check. There could be some sort of federal law that says if it's a mailbox in particular, that if you remove it, you are obligated to reinstall it. I can actually look into that and find out.
How many mailboxes are we talking about that exist now?
We could get
None of them.
it's not many. I think it's probably 5 or 6. And we can get when Jesse's there tomorrow, he could count them up, and we have all the photos, but yeah, it's like 5 or 6. It's not a lot of money, to be quite honest with you, relative to the project, the sleeves. You're not talking about a tremendous amount of money.
Probably a lot of people have a P.O. box. They don't get mail all year round, et cetera. So if we canvass people and said, "You want a box?" We could do it for you, but if you don't have an existing box and you want one, maybe they would have to pay for the installation, et cetera, because you'd want to bore a hole through the pavement and so forth, right?
Yeah, that's actually a great point, Tim, and thank you for bringing that up. I forgot to mention it. There are some properties down there that don't have a mailbox currently. I would recommend that those properties be contacted specific to their desire to have a mailbox, because once the sidewalk goes in, remember, it's all monolithic concrete. After that, they would be hard pressed to install a sidewalk. So if somebody does not have one, we reach out to them. They may say, oh yes, I would like one. At the very least, if they say, well, I was thinking about putting one in, we could put the sleeve in and then leave it. But once the sidewalk goes in with no sleeve, it does become quite the project to, like you said, to literally core a hole, et cetera, to put in a mailbox.
So Jesse, you're thinking like a 2x2 box beam powder coated with a plate on the top? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, that would be the most basic form. There's everybody's probably seen more ornate things.
Fluted post of some sort.
Yeah. It's really kind of, if the project's going to fund it, it's going to be a cost item. And to Kurt's point, there's not that many that would have to do anyway.
I would think that we would go a long way with the homeowners. We are disrupting their properties. Granted, some we're going to make better, some may be the same. I mean, for 6 or 7, for half a dozen mailbox posts, I think putting in an attractive post is a nice idea, and I don't think it's going to cost that much more.
Is that a motion?
Yes, that's a motion.
Well, excuse me, but wouldn't you want to also include canvassing all the abutters to see who may want one? And if so, the abutter would be responsible to pay for the material, et cetera, to put the thing in, because they don't have it there now.
If they currently don't have one, yeah, that makes sense, Tim.
Can I interrupt? I think that whether or not they have one or want one, we should have, and I may have missed this because again, it was cutting out when Kurt was talking, but there should be a cutout for a post in front of every house so that whether or not they want one now, one can be installed, because if property owners change and they decide to get mail there, to the concrete. So I think part of the project should definitely have that opening for the mailbox, then canvass the people if they want it, whatever we do, replace the ones that are there and then canvass to see if others want it. But at least in future, we can always, a mailbox can be installed in future without having to cut into that sidewalk.
I think a lot of, if we look around on Portland and in other neighborhoods, a lot of the mailboxes are clustered. Rather than having a mailbox right in front of every single house, you'll have 3 or 4 mailboxes in one location, sometimes even on one stand. So I agree that if you have an existing box and we're removing it, we should replace it. It's not going to be a huge expense to put in, a nice looking post and a nice looking box and call it a night. There's only, a handful of them. To go and ask every single homeowner, are you at some point going to want a box? That's, now we're going to have a cut in front of every little cottage on Hartford Avenue. It's kind of a mess. I would suggest that we make an accommodation for possible future boxes, but do that in a clustered fashion. So we have a couple spots, or even think about, down at the community center, there are essentially PO boxes in front of the community center, having a situation where maybe we can have if not at the community center, somewhere else, a lot of either communal boxes or at least clustered boxes in 2 or 3 locations.
I think then we're talking about really polling to figure out what we really need to get a better handle on it before we really make a decision one way or the other is what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing.
And it does not hold us up. That's the nice thing about it. It's a very sort of standalone item. It won't impact us moving forward because it's literally on the plan sheet. It's just a call out for mailbox sleeve. So if we don't have a resolution on it today, it's absolutely fine from our
We get
standpoint.
some ideas of what the posts might cost us, and then it might help us make a decision one way or the other next meeting.
We can get some data to that point, and I'll send it to Mary Jo, and she can distribute it. Some example images and some costs.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's Hartford Avenue. Now we'll transition to Shore Road, and we will take a walk down Shore Road, similar to what we did for Harford Avenue. Bear with me, I'm just taking some notes. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yeah.
No.
There we go.
Okay.
Yep.
So Shore Road. So this is the graphic that essentially shows the location of the sidewalk. This is what was provided to DOT. So had a good conversation with DOT, District 2 in Norwich. They are the ones that will essentially govern, for lack of a better term, what goes on Shore Road. I don't envision much input from Newington based on what they've indicated. Most of this just happens at the district level. So we provided this to them, and their initial feedback was send this to us, and we will. So they did give us some design considerations. Number one, the sidewalk does need to stay within DOT's right of way. They don't want to get into anything outside of their right of way. Unlike things on town property, DOT is not willing. They're just not set up for it to deal with anything that goes outside of their right of way. We think we have plenty of right of way out there to put the sidewalk in, so we don't think that's going to be an issue. And we will confirm that when we do meet with District 2 once we've wrapped up the preliminary design. For them, ADA compliance is critical, which it is for all these projects, Harford Avenue and Shore Road. So making sure that everything we do, and that's essentially the maximum 2% cross slope on the sidewalk, and then it's all the ramps. These would all be CONDOT standard configuration type ramps, and CONDOT has done a really good job of having a series of different types of ramps for all their sidewalks. They want a 3 to 4 foot grass strip between the edge of road or curb line and the edge of sidewalk for both buffering and to accommodate their signs. As you might imagine, DOT is extremely concerned about maintenance of their signage, et cetera, so they want to maintain that strip so that their signs are not affected by the project. They need a 48-inch clear path on the sidewalk. So as this is laid out, that's something that we need to think about. And then lastly, one of the big things they talked about was access control, where They are extremely concerned about wide open, I'll call it informal driveways to properties along their right of way. They are very concerned about the movement of vehicles across pedestrian routes, I should say defined pedestrian routes. He did warn me that they have had issues with some towns where because it was on a state road, the town, although it was a town funded project, the town wanted DOT to essentially tell these homeowners, hey, or not home, property owners, hey, we need to modify your driveway entrance or something. And DOT said, we won't do that. That is up to the town that wants to do the sidewalk. And he said, we've actually had a few projects where there were some access control issues. We could not reach an agreement with the town on how the sidewalk transitioned that access control issue, and therefore we would not grant approval. It's an encroachment permit. We would not grant an encroachment permit for the project, and the project was not completed. So he stressed that it will be up to the project at the town level to address the encroachment or the access control issues with the individual property owners. And I'll point some of those out as we walk down the road. So that's an overview of their sort of design guidelines. What they did indicate is that because I had suggested if they wanted to meet us out there, if they wanted us to meet with them before the design, they said no, complete a preliminary design that you think is reasonable, meets our needs or our criteria, then present it to us and we will give you feedback. So that's what we are proceeding with right now. So let's take a walk down Harford Avenue, Shore Road, and then we'll pull up the next plan set that Jesse pulled together, very similar to what we did on Harford Avenue. So here we are beginning at the police station is off to our right in the grassed area there. Right now, this is where the laydown area is for the water project. On some of these slides, I put the sidewalk in there, but please understand it's sort of plus or minus. It'll be much clearer when we look at the actual plans. So I'm not going to dwell too much on that, but so just an example of, I called out a 3-foot strip here, but so you can just get a feel for where the sidewalk goes. Oh, the other thing that they indicated was that their recommendation was that we not try to engage Eversource to relocate utility poles as part of the project. My recommendation is that we not engage Eversource with requests to relocate utility poles. Rather, we work around them. I make that recommendation for 2 reasons. Number one, the time. They may not be able to accommodate our schedule, in particular in instances where they really have no need to move their pole because maybe the pole, it's not slated for replacement where it is currently. They're quite happy with this location. But number 2, also the cost. They would most likely charge you for every pole. And it's because from their standpoint, the poles for their purposes don't need to be moved. If the town wanted them moved, they would say, well, we could potentially do it for you, but you're going to have to pay us to do it. And those costs could be substantial. So our recommendation at this time is we leave the utility poles alone. So continuing down as we approach Swan Avenue, again, this area is great because it's all grass, relatively easy for the sidewalk. So here's an example where we make our first crossing at Swan Avenue, kind of in general terms, and you'll see this repeat as we make each various crossing ADA compliant, CONDOT standard curb ramps at each side of the crossing, CONDOT standard crosswalk across each of the crossings. In some instances, we will have to relocate stop signs and stop bars. In this example, the stop signs on the wrong side of the road. The reason we'd have to relocate those is to make sure that the stop sign coincides with the stop bar, which also coincides with the location of the crosswalk. We will have to look at that with respect to sight lines and such out onto 156. But that's something we'll refine as we move through the process. And of course, we'll probably get DOT's feedback on some of those items. We've labeled new curb returns, and essentially what we're talking about there, as you may recall, not all of this section of Shore Road has bituminous curbing. We would put some bituminous curbing even in areas where there is no curbing. We'd put some bituminous curbing proximal to the sidewalk because we're going to need to have some sort of a backing for where the sidewalk ramps down. So that's what the curb return is. It's just a short segment of curbing, bituminous, that would get installed to basically frame the sidewalk ramp. So that's what that means. So again, here's an example, as I think, Jim, you brought up, where you've got the sign that's there. We would probably work to the left of this utility pole. It could be to the right. DOT may have something to say about that, but in any event, here's a great example of where we've got a sign pretty much right, no matter what route we take, it's pretty much right in the way. So we will have to make a decision on how those are dealt with. Additionally, as you could see, they have an entrance right onto this onto Swan Avenue. You could use this as an opportunity to make determinations. Do you want to just leave those as they are? Is the president there? Or do you want to use this as an opportunity to close some of those off? And that's really up to the committee's discretion. So continuing down, here's an example of some driveway access management that's going to be required because it's a wide open driveway with limited ingress egress definition. The Pizza Plus sign is a great example of what Frank brought up a few minutes ago. As you can see, it has some electrical uplighting, as well as access management issues, but in particular for the sign as an example. If we remove the sign, we will also have to remove the lights. There's electrical conduit, or there could be just direct buried wire under there that within the limits of the sidewalk work would have to get removed. If the project were to handle reinstallation of these signs, and again, as Frank brought up, is this sign in conformance with your current regulations? If it's not, does the project have to fund a new sign that is in conformance with the regulations? Additionally, using this uplighting as an example, anytime you touch something that's electrical in nature, you have to bring it up to code. So if these lights and the circuit feeding them isn't up to code, if the project replaces this sign, does the project have to fund putting in a new electrical service for this sign that is up to current standard? This could mean running a new electrical service from his building all the way out to this sign. And unfortunately, the way codes are defined, in particular electrical codes, plumbing codes too, it's an all or nothing proposition. So in other words, if any part of this system is not up to code, once we touch it, we have to bring the entire system up to present day codes. So that's something really to think about, because as you might imagine, those costs could could quickly escalate if we
That's
did
a
it.
question, Kurt, at this point, question. Ha- Have, have you ever dealt with the situation where you have encroachment signs and things of that nature, where rather than reinstalling it, just a stipend was given, a straight out stipend, and said, okay, for every sign we're going to remove as part of this project, we're going to give the property owner X number of dollars, you put in whatever sign and deal with it yourself.
You know, I don't think I have. Rob or Jesse, have you guys ever run into anything like that?
Not that I can recall.
Yeah, I haven't come across that. It's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
Well, this way, it kind of gets us out of the mix, and legally or from a town perspective, Bonnie, Mary Jo, Tim, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, maybe we ought to go all the way down the street and see how much.
Okay, so we'll
I
keep
didn't
that
hear that.
as a possibility.
This may not be practical and it may be too clunky, but is there any kind of solar technology where you can have standalone sort of electric generation for the sign?
Yeah, and I think that that's where it's a good suggestion to say that, we are willing to give a grant of this much to, redo whatever it is that has to be moved because of this project. We have the right to do the project. My question also is, I understand that the town, the state is not willing to tell these property owners that they have to move things, but how do we have that right to tell them? Is it because of the project that we have the authority?
Yes, because you're putting the project in, they look at you in a sense as the project owner. So they would look to the project owner to have all the interactions with the property owners for these types of things.
Okay. All right.
If it was DOT doing the project, they would be the project owner. And of course, then they would be on the hook to do it. But in these municipal cases, and he cited that they do run into a lot of this with both lot SIP and connectivity where they are town projects. So he said it really falls on the town to have that responsibility.
Okay.
So continuing down, so there's Pizza Plus on the right. Again, a little access management issues there with the wide open sidewalk that you'll see some of the initial concepts that Jesse has defined. Another example here is you can see the vegetation that's going to have to get removed at least partially for the sidewalk to go through. Here's an example of where there is curbing. So our curb ramp would go in, and that's an approximate location, of course. We would saw cut that curbing probably somewhere in the vicinity of the tire scuff mark, and then just blend in the new bituminous curbing. Again, trying to save costs. You don't want to fund recurbing hundreds of linear feet of curbing. It gets expensive very, very quickly. So continuing down, here's Hartford Avenue. Again, a very typical situation, similar to Swan with the utility pole and the crossing. So again, modifying the stop sign and stop bar to coincide with the final location of the crosswalk, not doing anything with the catch basins. The curb returns would essentially butt up against the back of the basin. More vegetation that's in the path of the sidewalk that would have to get removed. Here's an example of where there's a little curb cut there that probably used to be a structure on that property that had a curb cut or something. We could leave that, but if we put a sidewalk through there, DOT would not allow, as presently configured, that to remain. It would have to be a formalized curb cut. So there's an example of where we may need to interact with that property owner to find out what that's used for, is it desired, et cetera, et cetera.
Is that pedestrian crosswalk where you would want it to be finally?
You will notice that the pedestrian crosswalk has been relocated down here, and that'll quickly become apparent when you see Jesse's drawing.
So this one has to go.
Yes, yep. Continuing down, and bear in mind, these posts do not represent the back of the right of way. The back of the right of way is back in here. That's a plus or minus outside edge of the sidewalk. As you can see, this would have to get relocated into that strip, which is why DOT wants it. We'd have to work around these utility poles. You're talking about some pretty significant vegetation removal in this area. Topography is pretty good, nice and flat. Opens up a little bit as we approach Portland. And again, very similar to the other ones where we have crosswalk, ramps on either side, adjustment of the stop sign and the stop bar accordingly to coincide with where the crosswalk ends up. This stake is not the edge of the right of way. That was a control stake. The right of way is back here. Crossing over, again, maintaining existing curb lines, not disturbing drainage systems. You can see again why they want to have the strip, especially in cases where we have these double posted signs. They're pretty big signs. We may have to, and this would be something we ask DOT, their standard is where there is pedestrian walkways, the bottom of the signs 7 feet from the level of the sidewalk. We'll confirm with them if any of these signs need to be readjusted. Continuing down. Let's see. That's the boat that we've talked about right there. Sort of a marker. Here's an example of a pretty good driveway. Not too much that we need to do there. There's another view of it where that's a pretty well controlled driveway. So we have in Flets at 276 Shore Road. So we really haven't called for much changing in the configuration, just some new curb returns, standardizing. You'll see that on the drawing in a minute, standardizing some of these. But here's an example of a good driveway that I think DOT would say we're fine with it. You can leave it as is. The boat is just to the back of the sidewalk, so it may or may not need to be relocated. Here's an example of where there's existing mailbox. In this particular case, it's in the grass strip. We probably wouldn't have to touch it as part of the project. Just another view standing in the driveway, looking down. Again, pretty good topography through here, relatively flat. So similar to that upper part of Harford Avenue, pretty straightforward as far as the sidewalk going in. So here's an area where it's pretty wide open, where you've got some informal parking that DOT is always not in favor of. It's pretty uncontrolled. You've got some vehicles parking at 90-degree angles, wide open to the travel way. In this case, these vehicles would be parked across the sidewalk, which obviously we can't have. So there's definitely going to be some access control in here required. And again, when we look at the drawing, you can see the initial concepts of that. Again, pretty wide open. So this will have to be, and I keep using this term, cleaned up, but what we mean is putting in some curbing and controlling the movement of vehicles. So again, very similar to what you've seen before. This is one instance where there's no curb on that side that we would recommend putting in a curb to control the access into that roadway. It's really dangerous having things wide open like that. You could see how a vehicle could just cut straight across here coming into there. It gets hazardous. So especially with a sidewalk there, critical that we have those curb returns to make sure that we're defining the edge of the road at the sidewalk. So this is one example of where it's just a wide open no man's land. Again, catch basins to remain, and our new curbing would just butt right up against the edge of the basin, sort of that'd be a limit of work point, if you will. Signage and mailboxes that could remain as is. This does not represent the edge of the right of way. The right of way is actually back much farther. So here's an example of more driveway access management required that you'll see on the drawing. This property has 3 separate points of ingress and egress. The way this one's configured, it's more one directional this way for the most part, but we need to think about how we kind of clean those up. Here's an example of certainly of a project challenge. We have a guy wire and a utility pole, so that makes things tough relative to routing of the sidewalk. More access management required here. The sidewalk would be in this vicinity. This is a guy wire, so again, we'd have to work out the details of that. And again, a lot of feedback from DOT is going to be very helpful on this. Approaching the end of the project, these would most likely have to get relocated. Utility poles stay. Clearly, we're going to go to this side of the pole. Drainage stays. Working around the hydrant. This is an example of just, it's very, very wide open here. So we'd look to put in a new return just to clean this up again. Here's the edge of the road. You can see how large this is. Several times when I've been out there, you know, people take this corner at 50 miles an hour because it's so wide open. I'll be very interested to see what DOT says about that. Was that done purposely by DOT because they wanted to clear people off the road, or are they going to be okay with putting a curb line in here, tightening it up a little bit? We'll see. We'll see what they have to say. There's just another view of pretty much how wide open it is. Right here, where I'm pointing at that stop sign, is where the bituminous sidewalk ends. Our plan would be to pick up at that point, bring the concrete sidewalk up a little bit, specific dimension to be determined, so we can create a crosswalk similar to the other ones to make a nice connection to that sidewalk. So we'd bring it up to somewhere over in here, put in a proper ramp, and then go across to connect. There wouldn't be anything to this side of the road.
Kurt, that's a stop sign way back there, right?
That would have to get relocated. Yep, that's way back there. So I'm certain that if somebody is really complying with the letter of the law, they come to a complete stop here, and then they creep till they can see to the right and to the left before they pull out. So we'll take a look at that, and certainly DOT is going to have something to say about that. Go ahead.
The fire station is up the street there. Do we need any discussion again with Dave or the fire department on the vehicle entrance and exit there?
I think when we talk to them about the hydrants, certainly we should talk about this and see if they have any feedback. I suspect they won't, because we're going to modify the curb lines in such a way that we wouldn't in any way hinder movement of their vehicles. But we should certainly let them know what we're doing and ask them if they do have any kind of concerns because of the proximity of the fire station.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to open up the plans. There are 2 plans for Shore Road. So bear with me while these open. We can only open one at a time. Oh, actually, I'm gonna open up the other one first so we go in the same direction. Everyone see that?
Yep.
All right, so there's starting at the police station at Old Colony. So again, we're walking in the same direction. I'll blow it up so it's a little easier to see. So there you could see the sidewalk. And again, it would be ramps. And Jesse, I'm not sure if you want to chime in on any of these layouts. This is very preliminary. I want to stress that based on what DOT said, we wanted to get something down on paper that we could then start to get their feedback. Our concern was that if we took the design too far, they would come back and want us to change a bunch of things. So we're calling these preliminary design, but in reality, these are maybe a notch below preliminary, specific to Shore Road. So I just wanted to point that out. And we definitely want your feedback today that if there's things that are a concern or of particular interest to the committee, we can make those changes before we send these on to DOT.
Kurt, we talked to Mizzy Construction, a water company contractor,
Yep.
and in return for using that staging area, they would be willing to provide access off of Old Colony Road and Swan Avenue to have sort of a semicircular loop for a bus shelter with it probably within the right of way there, with it like a glass shelter, so the bus would go in Old Colony, let's say, and start going along the south end of that property and then re-enter via Swan to get back on Run 156. So they're willing to box out a road for us.
Okay.
So we might have to provide for some driveway to not disrupt that curbing that wraps around.
So would it be closer to the sidewalk versus interior to the lot?
I would say so. I mean, it's hard to visualize, but you would have to have it wide enough for a bus, and then the shelter would be near the sidewalk. So whatever would be comfortable to get the thing in there and then come back out again.
Okay. The nice thing about that is, given the sidewalk and the timing of it, it sounds like that can happen almost independent of the project if it had to.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning if one project was ahead of the other in either way, it's okay. One wouldn't hold up the other, if you will.
Right.
As long as we kind of give them an idea where it needs to go, I think Tim brings up a good point too. We need to also look at the turning radiuses, make sure those are appropriate for not only the area that they're going to box out, but also getting back onto Shore Road.
Absolutely.
We haven't talked to
really
DOT about it, and hopefully they would be willing to allow us to use part of their right of way. I don't know how much would be on town, how much would be on that state south of the dotted line, but it would be in there somewhere.
Yep, you certainly will need DOT's permission to put really anything within their right of way, and they'll be in a maintenance agreement that will be required as far as the town taking on the responsibility for maintaining that stuff.
What do you figure the distance is between the north end of the sidewalk and the dotted line? How many feet is that about?
Jesse, help me out here. In the middle of the property, in the middle of 290, equidistant between Swan and Old Colony, that's probably 25 feet. I'm just looking at the travel lane width. We have that in the computer. We can give you pretty darn accurate distances.
Well, we'd probably have to understand how wide the bus lane would be going through there. It would probably be fairly, I mean, it wouldn't have to be unusually wide, but it would probably only one bus at a time, of course.
Yep. I also feel that, and then you need to think about direction of travel. Will it be a one-way type thing,
Probably it would
two-way?
be- the bus would be going from right to left, from east to west.
So as Frank mentioned, the turning radius will be very important, and DOT will want to understand what that is. They're always concerned about curb cuts in close proximity to the travel way. So they're always in favor of curb cuts being further away because of queuing distances and those kinds of things. So it'll be something that they'll certainly be interested in.
One thing that's changed also since I first proposed that little bus area is that they're now running full-size buses down Shore Road. When I first proposed this, Nine-Town Transit had the little mini buses. So that was, and not being, civil engineer, obviously, but just kind of doing a back of an envelope calculation, it seemed to me that it was pretty easy to get those little mini buses in there and have the appropriate widths. I'm not so sure with the new buses they're running now. We'll probably have to reach out to Nine-Town Transit and ask them, is that a permanent situation, or are they just doing that now for the coronavirus shutdown, where they're maybe combining lines? I don't know what they're doing, but I've noticed that suddenly they've switched to the bigger buses. It's certainly not for demand, because the small buses ran completely empty most of the time, and these big buses are running completely empty. So I'll have to see what they're.
Too, Jim, last week. I was surprised by that.
Yeah. I'll have to see what their situation is.
You probably have to build it to take the larger bus, just because we don't know what's going to happen in 15, 20 years.
Right.
I suspect that's the prudent thing to do, is to build it so it can accommodate the larger bus, because there could be, regardless of it, let's assume it is a temporary situation, it could change in the future. In that case, I suspect your curb cuts would probably be somewhere well back of the highway line. If it is can you see the hand?
Yeah.
Because particularly if you're coming out onto Swan, you need to have that queuing distance. So your entrance is probably going to be somewhere back here. But we can run those turning radius. We have the software that we can check that and kind of get a better feel for where that might be. So I'm going to close this drawing, and then most of it's on the next drawing. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
So we'll start, because we're going in the other direction. So here's where we cross Swan. And again, some of the overlap. Here's Dimitri's, there's the sign. As you can see, and Jesse, please feel free to chime in. We've got some access control in here. Creating some new islands. And we'll have to refine this as we look at vehicle movements, but the concept is to eliminate these wide open no man's land, as the DOT gentleman called them, and to create some sort of control. Oh, by the way,
Kurt, that dotted line, that semi-dotted line, that's actually the state right of way?
that is the state right of way. That's correct.
Wow, that's
So that's
much farther back than I thought.
Yep. It usually is. Yeah, the state has a pretty good size right of way down here. And we always warn people, don't assume that where the roadway is necessarily represents where the right of way is. It can meander within the right of way. Sometimes it's right up against it on one side, sometimes it's in the middle. But yeah, it's kind of dramatic when you stand out there. If you recall in the photos we're just looking at, if you think of where that line is when you're standing out there, it's pretty far off the curb line.
Mhm.
So,
Can I ask a question, Frank?
absolutely.
So the gas station, the new gas station, most of their sidewalk appears that it's in the state roads right away. Did they get approval for that?
Bonnie, you'd have to recall on that. I believe they did have to get approval for that sidewalk on the state property.
They did. I can confirm that that happened through District 2, the same folks that we'll be working with. So they had to get an encroachment permit, have it reviewed and approved by DOT.
So maybe with that precedent in mind, they will be a little bit more understanding with our bus shelter too. Hopefully.
Yeah, because that there is a budding paving there.
Thank you.
Kurt, in these areas where the black line along the road isn't there, does that mean the bituminous curb does not go in those locations?
No, that essentially means that we're not, if it's there, we're not replacing it. So for example, there is curbing here. We're just not replacing it. We're going to leave it as is.
So there would be curb all the way along.
In some, for example, down off the sheet over here, there isn't curbing, and we would not propose putting in curbing unless you wanted to, but just again, trying to control costs.
Yeah, right.
Where there is curbing, for example, here, we would just leave it undisturbed, and our new returns would just butt up against that existing curbing.
All right.
And again, you could replace this curbing, but it's a cost item that is just going to come out of your budget. We would recommend just leave it. There's where, as we talked about earlier, DOT has their paving project coming up. As we review these plans with them, we'll try to get a little more detail as to what that paving project includes. Are they looking at replacing curbs? Sometimes they are as part of those projects. So we'll try to find that out.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Kurt, quick question on Cottage Lane, which is the corner of where the package store is and the old appliance store there. In front of the old appliance store on the east side of Cottage Lane, it's all pavement. And next door to that, we have that informal parking area, which is gravel. Is the sidewalk going to be flush with that? Will it be raised? Will there be any kind of transition? Or is it just going to go into the existing, kind of cut into what's there already?
Yep, that's a great question. So let's transition down to there. If you recall, as the little sort of point of demarc, there's the boat that we talked about. If you recall, I mentioned the boat is just to the back of the sidewalk. I think that was 276. So just so people, and here's a good example of where I was talking about minor cleanup on their driveway. Pretty good. Here's where it gets difficult. DOT has confirmed they will not allow flush sidewalks in these kind of areas because it's dangerous. They don't want pedestrians being at the same level of the roadway. They want curb control, buffer strip, etc. So we would be removing all of this informal whatever, putting in curbs. Yeah. Now, this is, I mentioned before, on this particular property, see this, I don't know if you can see it, this very light gray line.
Yes.
That is actually the property line, and it runs where I'm drawing here, straight back. So the way we have it configured now is this driveway technically serves 274. This has no driveway. So I think we're probably going to have to engage these people and find out what they want, right? There may be a single driveway cut here that serves this. The problem is it's very close to the outlet of Cottage Lane. So we're going to have to see what DOT thinks about that. They may want some, so we have to find out. This is an example of where DOT said they've run into problems with other towns where the town didn't want to engage the property owner. In fact, he mentioned one, he didn't say what town it was, but they had a situation like this, and the people threatened to sue the town. And the town said, hey, DOT, can you help us? And the DOT said, no, it's your project. You're on your own. And the town said, well, we don't want to fight that fight. Can we just put a flush sidewalk all the way across? And DOT said, no, we won't allow that because now you're just inviting someone to get hit, because a sidewalk infers that it's a safe area to walk, and it defeats the very purpose of what they call access control. We have got these wide open, uncontrolled vehicle movements, ingress and egress. So I look at this as one of those, I don't want to say tricky areas, but certainly an area where we'll have to talk to these property owners, let them know about the project, and find out what their driveway needs are.
They did a,
This is Jesse. I had intended that to be a shared. They're owned by the same person.
And yep, and it could be, the problem is if one property gets sold, now you have a pickle.
Well, you could
So we
still
can-
have it written in that it's a shared
Oh, definitely.
driveway.
Yeah. But I think we need to.
That's the only
engage
real
folks.
feasible there, to get them in there, and they have frontage to park between the building and the right of way still at that particular location at 272, and then 274 looks like they kind of go back to some sort of garage type building or something there.
Yeah,
those are,
Jesse
those are
points out,
apartments back there.
this is because of Cottage. The way Jesse has it is really the ideal configuration because you want that separation. So this is kind of a interesting one.
DOT did allow DOT did allow a flush sidewalk over at the gas station. It's flush to the pavement in front of the gas pumps, and it's a disaster because cars are essentially always on that sidewalk.
Yeah, that's a really dangerous scenario. I'm assuming on the street side though, there is curbing.
There's curbing on the street side,
Yeah.
but not on the gas station side. So essentially, the sidewalk is part of
Yeah.
the gas pump project there.
And that, I don't want to say it's common, but there's definitely instances of that, whether it be topography or whatever. They will not allow it to occur on the street side.
Mm.
Yeah, personally, I'm not a fan of that scenario where even on the back, you've got the flush adjacent to areas where vehicles move. You're just asking for trouble. Even somebody simply backing up, there's nothing to prevent them from going right across the sidewalk. So I feel that that's not a good scenario. So certainly some discussion similar to some of the issues on Harford Avenue in here will be required. So as you can see, Jesse's creating some control into Cottage Lane, which is good. That's very much desired. Some access control through here, kind of cleaning things up a little bit. Over through here, really eliminating this entrance point, which personally I think because of the circulation and the parking, I think that's the right thing to do. That will have to be discussed with that property owner. And again, we'll see what DOT says also, right? DOT may say, well, for one property, we're certainly not going to allow him to have 3 curb cuts on our road. So DOT is certainly between the town, the property owners, and DOT, there's 3 parties involved in all of these discussions. So it certainly makes it a little more complex than Harford Avenue. As we approach Cross Lane, sorry about that little box there, following the sidewalk, and as I had mentioned, creating the crosswalk there, and then we don't show it here, but we're extending the sidewalk up to that point to be able to get across. And again, we have no right-of-way issues. You can see the highway line is way back here. In this area, it probably gets the closest within the whole corridor, just because the way that things shifted. You can see all the room we have over here. There's an example of where they tweaked the roadway within their right-of-way. So that's the initial concept. And again, I'm calling it preliminary design, but it's the concept that is an initial run through of what we can begin to bring to DOT to get their feedback. We'd be open to the committee's thoughts on how we want to progress, meaning, would you like, I can send a link to all these materials. The committee can give us some feedback on this, or we could use this and reach out to DOT and say, look, this is just an initial shot, with the understanding that the committee is also looking at it, but that we're soliciting DOT feedback. We could also, well, I guess my recommendation would be, before we engage property owners, that we hear back from DOT. Because I'd hate to make any kind of a commitment to a property owner and then run counter to what DOT may say.
Well, I think that.
Agree with you.
Yeah, definitely agree with that, Kurt. We need to get DOT's buy-in on a plan before we talk to anybody.
Yeah. So would the committee like to take these? I can send a link and have a chance to look at them, and then maybe funnel feedback through Mary Jo.
Sure.
I almost feel like I'm putting you on the spot here, asking for feedback. You know, you've just seen it for the first time, unlike Harford Avenue, where we've had a lot more,
Well, Mary Jo sent us a link, so we were able to download this a couple days ago at least.
So you guys already have it?
Yeah.
I forgot about that. I apologize.
And it's a terrific design. It's a nice ideal design, I think.
To Jesse.
So I think it'd be great to bring this to DOT and see what they think, and then scuff it up after that. The sticky part's going to be the parking in front of the appliance store and Dimitri's sign and a couple other things. But it's a great place to start, I think.
I agree.
I agree as well.
Kurt, let's see. Would we be able to, on the actual picture one where you see the conditions at eye level, could those same lines for the sidewalk and the 3-foot strip be superimposed on those picture things so we can see what signs need to be removed and that sort of thing more easily?
They could be depicted on there. They would have to be considered sort of approximate, just because of the perspective of the photo, and then as you try to lay straight lines in there. But we could certainly update those based on this drawing that you're looking at, and put some little markers, little red arrows with call outs and those kinds of things. That would be pretty easy to do.
Okay. Because I think for instance, the signage, it would
Would you
be,
first get back to before you do that?
That's really up to the committee. I think my recommendation would almost be yes, to get DOT feedback first.
that's
I
a good
agree.
idea.
And I say that
There's no
because,
sense in going through the exercise. You probably don't need any more practice. So you might as well like to. But I'm thinking that in my head, we're dealing 3, possibly 4 signs at max. You've got Dimitri's, you got Pizza Plus or whatever they call themselves now, Teddy's, and I don't know if the liquor store has a sign out front or not. So
Yeah.
there's probably only a maximum of 4 signs. You know, without looking
There's
at hedges.
also, there's also vegetation, so if you have to take out a lot of bushes and stuff, that the person would need to know that too.
Yeah, grubbing vegetation is one thing, but taking out signs and reinstalling them, that could get expensive, as we talked about earlier.
I don't even know that Dimitri even has a sporting goods store anymore. It's sort of a vestigial sign.
Well, this is our opportunity to kind of clean that. We've been talking about signage, on 156 for years, and what a mess it is. So it's an opportunity to do that, and whether we plan on reinstalling the signs as part of the project or figuring out what a reasonable stipend is for each property owner to reinstall their own sign, at least that way we can get some uniformity or some cleanup to it.
Yep.
For the restaurants also, the beverage companies will install signs if you put their logo on there.
Right.
So you can always approach, Anheuser-Busch or whoever owns them now, or Coca-Cola, Pepsi, etc.
Yeah.
Well, let the property owner do that. If we're going to give X amount of dollars, we'll take your sign out and then put it in, next to your building, you and reinstall it. And here's X amount of dollars. They may say, hey, great, I've got X amount of dollars, and Anheuser-Busch is going to put a sign in for nothing. I just made out on the deal.
Right.
Which is fine. That's fine.
oh, I did forget to point out, Tim, you had asked the question before where the crosswalk was. So here's an example. So again, here's the top of Harford Avenue. Here's our DOT compliant ramp with the crosswalk going across, and there would be some sort of a ramp system here to intersect with the sidewalk.
And Kurt, I know this was one of the crosswalks we talked about asking DOT if they're supportive of the painting method that makes it look 3D in an effort to slow down traffic, because this was one of the areas we felt was the curb, the way it's laid out, people take that turn quite fast.
Yeah.
And we were wondering, and with your guidance, you indicated that it certainly isn't standard, so we probably wouldn't get it. But that if we could do that 3D painting method that kind of confuses drivers and forces them to slow down, maybe they'd consider it at that point.
Yeah, we can absolutely ask the question.
Or possibly even a center road, stop and crosswalk, or stop for people in crosswalk sign, which we see show up on properties all over the place.
Yeah.
If we look at downtown Niantic, that's 156. That is the state road down there, and they do have delineated side crosswalks on 156. So it's certainly not something that DOT can or should just reject out of hand, because they do it in other parts of this particular state road.
Kurt, if you show this to DOT, then would you be able to roughly gauge the cost so we know how far we can do the 156 sidewalk before we run out of money?
Yes, definitely. DOT can probably give us some decent data based on a few of the most recent projects that they've done that are very similar to this. And essentially we would have a per square foot or square yard cost for the sidewalk, linear foot cost for curbing, cost of each handicap sidewalk ramp. So concurrent with the preliminary design, and this would apply to Hartford Avenue also, we'll do a detailed estimate so we know exactly where we are for both segments of sidewalk. And we'll literally start working on that this week.
Because this isn't federally funded, it's state funded, we don't have to go through all the baloney we had to go through on the southern part of Harford Avenue regarding inspections and multiple bookkeeping systems.
Correct. That's
Yes.
That's correct. Yeah, that's one of the nice things about this program is, as some of us recall, it was told to us numerous times, don't worry, it's a town project. This really is a town project.
It was a town project until we wanted to do something.
Yep.
Kurt, if it's capped at 400,000, would that avoid prevailing wage?
We just, Jesse, what was the new number? We just ran into this with, was it Cromwell?
Yeah, Cromwell was
It was a new number.
yeah, new construction under $1 million, but there was some other caveat language in there that we'd have to double check.
And likewise,
So-
I'll double check the connectivity, that there's a new connectivity grant guidance out. I'll go through that and just make sure we're well aware if we need that or not.
So we may end up with the state of Connecticut Department of Labor standard wage, but not have to go to Davis-Bacon wage, if I'm hearing that correct.
hopefully.
And Jesse, was it over $1 million was prevailing wage?
Yes, for new construction. Yeah.
So you may not even be a prevailing wage.
Yeah.
That significantly cuts the cost, significantly.
40%.
Hey, Kurt, with the proposal, the changes by the Easy Mart, or any of our changes actually, is there any conflict that you could see on the potential bike route on 156?
I don't see any conflicts. I think for bike routes on 156, it's because of the shoulder width. We would not have an impact, in my opinion, on that. And I think that's another great point, is that it's important for us to find out from DOT if, as part of their project from this area up to the Baldwin Bridge, were they looking at just paving, or were there other things that they were looking at?
And maybe remind them of our recommendations for the connection at the Baldwin Bridge.
Yeah. Yep. All right, so if I'm understanding correctly, you'd like us to present this to DOT for their initial feedback.
Yes.
That's what I think.
Yep.
Do we need a
will do
motion?
that.
I'll entertain a motion.
So moved.
I'll second.
Thank you, Jim. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you, Eric. It's unanimous.
All right, we will get that underway. Looking at my notes here, a lot of the items that we had on Shore Road were very similar to Hartford Avenue, meaning the encroachments and those kinds of things. So we have some of the signs. We know that there's some vegetation clearing along some of the properties. Not a tremendous amount, but something that relative to just communicating to folks. We had the one issue of this ramp, and that was really the only spot that sort of a wayward ramp occurred. But yeah, we'll get this in front of DOT. We'll get their itemized feedback. I'll compile an email back to Mary Jo for dissemination. In the meantime, please, if there's any other comments on this or Harford Avenue, send it back to us. Relative to Harford Avenue, we're going to press ahead, finalize that preliminary design. We'll get the cost estimate going. We'll get the information that we've talked about here, the mailboxes and those things. But I think we're in great shape on Harford Avenue, being able to move things forward. Jesse's going to be there tomorrow again to get some more of those detailed photographs and other measurements for that one particular group of properties. But we're in great shape as far as being able to wrap that preliminary design up and sort of call it final. Hopefully DOT will be able to get back to us relatively quickly on this. They are on a modified work schedule where they're not doing it in a uniform manner. Some people are coming in for 2 days and then they're out for a few days. So I'll just reach out to the gentleman that I chatted with. Seemed like a real nice guy, and just say, look, here's the stuff. When can you talk to me? And I'm hoping that's this week. And if I need to, like we're doing now, walk through it with him, I will. If he says, hey, come on down to Norwich and sit with me, I will. We'll press that forward to get their feedback because it is so important.
But you still are trying to get on Hartford Avenue, the 20.
21? Oh, no, was it?
21 and 18, correct?
So let's see. Let me just revisit my spreadsheet.
21 and 19?
19, yes, thank you. Unless 19 is no longer an issue.
I don't think 19 is actually needed anymore.
Okay.
So it sounds like it's just 21.
Yeah, the only thing that I've got here for 11 and 19 are those phantom curb cuts that we'll have to deal with.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
So,
Frank's going to try and get 21, hopefully.
Okay. So
Yeah,
tomorrow, Jesse will go on to 23, 27, 29, and 31. He'll stay off at 21. He'll do everything he can from behind the right-of-way line.
Regarding the individual issues, the curb cuts, and some of the things we've discussed that we need to engage the homeowners, what's the committee's just thought on doing that ahead of time before we have the community information planning? Do we send individual letters again to people with their specific thoughts on this, or what's the committee's recommendation?
Well, I thought we decided we were going to kind of come up with a little bit more solid preliminary plan before we present it to any individuals. We still have to deal with the topography transitions on at least 4 or 5 of those houses. So I thought we were going to kind of wait for that all to materialize before we started to kind of roll this out to individuals and get their opinions. I mean, that was my thought.
I'm not sure I got that pretty clear. So that's why I'm bringing it up again, because there were some properties that needed more discussion and we had more recommendations. So is Kurt going to provide us with some of those specifics and then talk to those people? And then are we having a community meeting?
My sense is that the low-lying properties, we need a little bit more information, and that design is going to be tweaked. So maybe we should wait until Kurt gets back to us with his recommendation on those properties. And, you know, if we sign off on that, then we can approach those property owners, you know, and in the same process, approach the property owners with the ghost curb cuts. So I think we have a little bit more, you know, a couple more decisions to make on our side that are going to be based on what Kurt comes back with. And then we can begin that process of contacting property owners probably first before we do a broad community meeting, because we don't want this stuff to blow up in our faces, at a meeting like that. If there are known issues, we should address them beforehand.
300%. Yeah.
So what are we thinking then, Kurt, as far as getting us these second version of recommendations for us to contact these folks with on your end?
Yeah, I mean, if Jesse is there tomorrow, we can start working on that this week. I think by the end of next week, we could probably have summarized thoughts on what the approach is, some sort of maybe like a bulleted list that's very easy for people to understand, and then some graphical materials of some sort that maybe at that point are in sketch format, but enough that coupled with the bullets convey the intent. And again, the purpose of that is to not get to such a level of detail. If somebody says, well, I don't like this at all, we don't want to spin our wheels. We want to give them enough. We also don't want to give up. I think Frank had mentioned earlier, we don't want it to be sort of like a blank check either. So we'll keep it broad enough that we maintain some flexibility for the committee, so you're not committing to a high level of detail at this point, because some of these people may say, oh, that's fine with me, great, and we don't want to give them all kinds of stuff that in the end maybe we didn't even need to, and overcomplicate things and spend all kinds of money when maybe we didn't have to.
So probably then looking at sometime in June for some kind of outreach planning meeting, as opposed to the end of May.
Yeah, I'm thinking if we have those to you, today's the 4th, if we have that stuff to you by the 15th, my recommendation would be to begin reaching out to people starting Monday, the 18th.
Do you need anything else from us then, Kurt, at this point?
I don't think so. Rob, Jesse, is there anything that I'm missing as far as stuff we may need from the committee? I don't think so, but help me out. Am I missing something?
I think that's enough. I think we can get going on this with the direction that we received so far.
Does the committee feel then we should wait to schedule another meeting till we see what we get back from Kurt? Or preliminarily?
Frank, you're on mute.
I'm sorry. One of my truck drivers just had an accident, so somebody came in and told me that. So I'm back again. I'm sorry. I missed that last conversation.
I was asking if the committee wanted to wait to plan another meeting for ourselves and BSC until after we get materials from BSC, or if we want to preliminarily decide, plan a meeting. If he is able to get us the stuff around the 15th, do we want to meet in the early of the following week and plan our outreach to these individual owners? Or ask any questions first?
What do you think the timeline's going to be on you getting any information from DOT?
I'm hoping to have some feedback this week. It depends on their work cycle. If this is one of their, what I'll call off weeks, it would be next week. But that certainly won't hold up Hartford Avenue. So we'll still commit on having everything wrapped up for Hartford Avenue on the 15th. I'm of the opinion that unless DOT, let's say I wasn't able to engage them till early next week, provided they don't have anything that's almost makes us go back to square one, we could probably have Shore Road to the next level of design by the 15th also. So I'm almost thinking, is it worth having a meeting on the 18th to review whatever materials we may have at that time? Certainly the Hartford Avenue stuff. We can talk about the mailbox posts, some of these other things. And then if we have Shore Road, we hope we do, we could also talk about it at that meeting too. But in any event, at least it'll keep the Hartford Avenue piece moving forward so we can get the committee's feedback on our proposals for those few properties on Hartford Avenue. And then, you know, if you guys had feedback on the 18th, we could very quickly tweak that stuff. But at the very least, it'll allow you to begin reaching out to property owners.
I would agree. I think that we could schedule it, and if we have to, we'll cancel it. But at least it'll be on the schedule to start with.
18th is fine with me.
Good.
Okay. Anybody have a conflict with 10 a.m. on the 18th?
Nope.
Yeah, well,
Point I
I'm
don't
gonna have to
know
put some parameters on the timeline here. It's a little tough for me, so,
We'll take you as long as we got you, Frank. Okay, all right, I'll schedule that. I'm assuming it'll still be WebEx for the 18th. All right, anything else for the committee? As far, or for BSC from
I
the
think it was a
committee?
productive meeting.
I do too.
This was
Thank
great for us. Thank you for
you.
everybody with the screen sharing and all that, but this was very, very helpful.
Great. Thank you very much. You guys did some great work. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Rob, Jesse, also.
Thank you.
Any further invoices for us to approve, Kurt, other than the one you sent?
No, we'll probably have one in a few weeks, I think. And so we could always, on the 18th, you know, you could act on it then.
Okay, Tim, did that first invoice get approved on your end?
I can't say I've seen an invoice, so I'll have to check with Nicole, I guess.
Okay, I think I saw a note from her saying that she had put it through for payment.
Okay.
Okay.
Time on the next one. No rush. No rush.
I guess then the last item before we adjourn is approval of minutes of April 21. And I think Eric had a feedback on that.
What I had mentioned, but there was something minor.
I could make a motion to approve.
I'll second.
And if we can't find your feedback, Eric, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right, a motion to adjourn?
So
Make a
moved.
motion to adjourn.
I'll second that.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Great week,
Bye.
everybody.
Two.
Hello. Hey. Hold on. Can you hear me all right? A little garbled, but just yeah. Sure. Mhm. Yeah, so I think we want the overall plans as we have them, and that defines where each segment is. And then we can break it up into the segments. I think it's going to be easier for them to review. Mhm. Yep. Yep. Now let's do it the way we just described it. Let's do all the generic, general information in one file. Then we'll break up each segment into their, no, we'll break up all the plan sheets in a different file, and then the cross sections in a third file. Okay, so we'll do all the general information in one, plan sheets in another, and the cross sections in a third. Okay. Yeah, I didn't think we had to do a grading plan. I saw a message from her and it confused me. I thought, you're right. Yeah, I didn't think we had to do a grading plan. All right. I just got off a 3-hour WebEx call with all mine. I think everyone was drifting off at the end. No, no, one guy, he was on mute because he was at his office and he had one of his truck drivers had an accident, and it's just like, yeah, we have to put a little more time restriction on these next time. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, that's why I didn't get back to you right away, because I was just a marathon call. Okay. All right. That sounds like a good plan, though. What do we need from Bill? General confirmation. Yeah. Yeah, you can send it over to Bill, copy me. I'm gonna probably follow up immediately with him with a conversation. Because I'm wondering, do we send it off to the town at the same time? And maybe he can just take a very preliminary look at it. You know, an hour of time saying this generally looks right. And then get it off to the town. They can comment on it while Bill is taking a more hard depth look at it. That's kind of what I was hoping to get this out sooner than later. Let's do that further down the line. Yes. At a 30% design, I don't think we need to get into the landscaping at this stage. All right. All right, perfect. All right. Yeah, when you make the PDFs, we'll just label them, 1 of 3, 2 of 3, 3 of 3, that type of thing, so they kind of know the order. And one will be plan sheets, one will be cross sections, and one will be just general information. Okay. Excellent, thank you. All right, bye.